What happens when curiosity meets temptation, and the rules are meant to be broken? The day had started like any other, the air warm with the hint of late afternoon sunlight filtering through the living room windows. I was visiting my friend's house, a casual stop after running errands nearby, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way the house smelled, clean, with faint notes of vanilla and fresh laundry, or maybe it was her presence. Her mother, standing in the kitchen, moved with a natural grace that made ordinary gestures feel purposeful. She was laughing at something my friend said, the sound low and melodic, but it carried a warmth that caught me off guard. I found myself noticing things I shouldn't, how her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, the subtle sway of her posture, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she smiled. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but when our eyes met across the room, I felt a flutter I didn't understand. I quickly looked away, blaming the sun in my eyes, but my mind lingered on that moment longer than I should have admitted. Something about her confidence, tempered with an underlying kindness, drew me in. She wasn't trying to impress me, and that made her presence feel magnetic. I helped with small tasks, passing a dish, straightening a cushion, and every interaction seemed charged with unspoken energy. Her hand brushed mine accidentally, or maybe not, and I felt a warmth linger long after the touch. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, but the gentle pressure of her fingers against mine, the soft warmth of her palm, was undeniable. Even the way she spoke to me made my chest tighten. Her voice was calm, measured, yet playful, with just a trace of teasing in the way she asked questions. Each word made me listen more intently, each glance made me feel caught between admiration and hesitation. My thoughts conflicted, spinning between fascination and guilt. I shouldn't feel this way, not about my friend's mom, but I couldn't ignore the pull. There was a moment when she handed me a book, her fingers brushing mine as she passed it over. Our eyes met again, and I could swear there was something in her gaze, a quiet challenge, a playful acknowledgement of something unspoken. I smiled, half embarrassed, half entranced. The air between us seemed to thrum with an invisible tension, a subtle current that neither of us fully named but both felt. By the time I left that afternoon, I realized I had been holding my breath more than I noticed, every movement and glance replaying in my mind. That simple, ordinary visit had left me unsettled in the best possible way, curious, captivated, and aware that something unanticipated had sparked between us. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew I wanted to see more, to understand the depth behind that warm, teasing smile and the quiet magnetism she carried effortlessly. And just like that, the seed was planted, a subtle, lingering curiosity that would grow slowly, quietly, until it demanded attention, drawing me back into her orbit again and again. A few days after that first visit, I found myself back at my friend's house, this time under the pretense of helping with a small project. It was something mundane, reorganizing a shelf in the living room, but the moment I stepped inside, I sensed the subtle shift in the air. She was there, her presence immediately filling the space with warmth and quiet authority. She caught my gaze and smiled, that familiar, knowing curve of her lips that made my chest tighten in ways I still didn't fully understand. "Looks like someone's eager to help," she said, her voice playful, teasing. I felt a flutter of nerves at the way she lingered near me, tilting her head slightly, her eyes sparkling with amusement. There was a lightness in her demeanor now, as if she enjoyed testing the boundaries between us without ever saying a word. We began the task together. As I reached for a box on a high shelf, she stepped close, her shoulder brushing mine, so slight I could convince myself it was accidental. Yet the warmth of her body so near mine and the subtle scent she carried, a hint of lavender mixed with something uniquely hers, sent a jolt through me that made my focus falter. I tried to concentrate on the box, but my eyes kept flicking to her, noticing the way her hands moved, the easy grace of her posture, the tiny laugh that escaped her when I fumbled slightly. She teased me effortlessly, making comments that walked the fine line between playful and suggestive. "Careful there," she said, as I reached awkwardly for a heavy book. "Wouldn't want to hurt yourself, or get distracted." The words were innocent enough, but the tone, the soft lilt of her voice, hinted at an intimacy I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. I laughed, trying to hide the sudden awareness of how close she was, how aware I suddenly felt of every small movement she made. Every gesture, every glance carried weight. When she handed me something, her fingers brushed mine in that lingering, fleeting way that made my pulse quicken. Our eyes met in quiet acknowledgement, a silent conversation passing between us. There was a teasing rhythm in our interactions, each smile, each glance, each accidental touch amplifying the tension between us. I caught myself imagining what it would feel like to step closer, to bridge the invisible space separating us. But there was hesitation, an instinctual awareness of the boundaries I shouldn't cross. And yet, the way she laughed at my distracted fumbling, the gentle teasing in her words, made it increasingly difficult to keep my composure. By the time we finished, I was flushed, aware of the magnetic pull she seemed to have over me. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, smiling as though she knew exactly the effect she had on me. And I realized, with equal parts thrill and guilt, that I was looking forward to the next moment, the next chance to be near her, to feel that subtle, playful connection that danced between us. It wasn't about rushing anything. It was about savoring the electric undercurrent of flirtation, the quiet intimacy of shared laughter, and the way small touches could speak volumes when words dared not. The seed planted earlier was growing, teasing me with the possibility of something deeper, and I was powerless to resist its pull. By now, my visits to my friend's house had become more than casual. I found myself noticing her mother in ways I couldn't quite explain, small, seemingly insignificant details that made ordinary moments feel layered with tension. It wasn't about attraction in the shallow sense, it was something deeper. Her presence carried a quiet magnetism, an emotional warmth that drew me in without any overt effort. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the couch, flipping through a photo album. She looked up when I entered, her smile soft and welcoming. "Come, look at this," she said, patting the space beside her. My heart thudded as I stepped closer, aware of the subtle intimacy of sitting next to her, the scent of her perfume mixing with the faint smell of old pages. Our shoulders brushed, light but deliberate, and I felt a surge of awareness in every nerve. We flipped through pictures together, commenting on childhood memories and family anecdotes. She shared stories with a warmth and humor that made me laugh, but there was an underlying depth to her voice, a subtle vulnerability that I hadn't noticed before. I found myself leaning slightly toward her, drawn to the authenticity she exuded, and she didn't shy away. Her presence was as inviting as it was intoxicating. Occasionally, our hands would brush while turning a page or passing a photo, lingering just a moment too long to be purely accidental. Each time, I felt a jolt, a reminder that our connection was charged in ways I wasn't supposed to acknowledge. Her eyes met mine more than once, and in those brief moments, it felt like we were speaking without words. There was curiosity there, yes, but also something softer, an unspoken recognition of shared understanding, of emotions carefully restrained yet palpable. I struggled internally. My thoughts oscillated between admiration and guilt. I reminded myself that she was my friend's mother, a woman with a life and responsibilities separate from my own. And yet, the pull of her energy was undeniable. I noticed how her hand would rest casually near mine, how her laughter lingered in the air, how her gaze seemed to catch me even when I thought I was looking elsewhere. It was subtle, but enough to keep my mind racing long after I left the room. There was a quiet tension in the air that neither of us acknowledged aloud. It wasn't urgent or desperate, it was measured, deliberate, and deeply human. I could sense her testing boundaries, not with overt actions, but through subtle signals, a brush of hair behind her ear, a glance that lasted just a fraction longer than normal, the soft inflection in her voice when she spoke to me. Each gesture teased the edges of propriety while inviting me into a deeper emotional space. By the time I left that day, I felt simultaneously exhilarated and unsettled. The attraction wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, something that made me question my own hesitation and wonder if she felt it too. For the first time, I understood the quiet power of lingering glances and the tension they could carry. Something unspoken was building between us, a delicate thread of connection that was impossible to ignore. And I knew, with a mixture of fear and anticipation, that it was only the beginning. A quiet evening settled over the house, the golden light of late afternoon slipping through the blinds and casting soft patterns across the floor. I was there again, ostensibly to help with something minor, but the moment I stepped in, I realized this visit would feel different. She was in the living room, seated comfortably on the couch, a book resting on her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes meeting mine with that gentle, warm recognition that made me feel both welcomed and uncomfortably aware of the subtle pull between us. "Sit down," she said softly, patting the couch beside her. The invitation felt heavier than words could express, carrying an unspoken intimacy that immediately heightened my senses. The faint scent of her perfume mingled with the warm, familiar smell of the room, grounding me even as my mind raced with the awareness of how close we were physically. We began talking about ordinary things at first, books, movies, her garden, but slowly, the conversation deepened. She shared a story from her past, one that revealed her loneliness after her children had grown, and the subtle regrets she carried. Her voice softened as she spoke, tinged with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I listened intently, drawn not just to her words, but to the way she seemed to lean slightly closer, unconsciously seeking the comfort of my presence. I realized, in that moment, that my feelings were no longer simple curiosity or admiration. I felt protective, deeply moved by her honesty, and intensely aware of the closeness between us. Her hand moved slightly as she adjusted her position, and our fingers brushed briefly, a fleeting touch that lingered longer than it should have. I didn't pull away, and neither did she. Instead, she allowed the subtle contact, as if acknowledging the unspoken connection growing between us. Our conversation wandered into more personal territory, dreams deferred, fears unspoken, moments of joy and heartbreak. I found myself opening up in ways I rarely did, speaking about my own uncertainties and the weight of expectations in my life. She listened, fully present, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made it impossible to hide anything. There was no judgment, only a quiet understanding, and the weight of that emotional intimacy left me both exhilarated and vulnerable. There was a silence after one of her confessions, the kind that isn't empty but charged, filled with unspoken acknowledgement. Our shoulders touched, almost by accident, and the warmth of her presence enveloped me. The subtle tension between us was palpable but restrained, as if both of us were aware of the boundaries yet curious about the emotional territory we were exploring. By the time I left that evening, the air between us had changed. It wasn't just attraction anymore, it was a recognition of shared vulnerability, an acknowledgement that something meaningful was building between us. The connection was quiet, slow, and deliberate, but it was undeniably there. I walked away with a sense of anticipation, aware that the next step, whenever it came, would be both thrilling and complicated. And deep down, I knew that whatever unfolded, this bond was already shaping the way I saw her, and myself, in ways I wasn't ready to fully articulate. It was a quiet evening when I found myself alone in the house with her. My friend had gone out for a while, leaving us in the living room with the soft hum of the city outside the windows. The warm glow of the lamps bathed the room in amber light, casting soft shadows along the walls. Every detail seemed heightened, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the gentle sound of her breathing, the rustle of fabric as she moved across the room. She was rearranging some books on the shelf, her movements graceful and deliberate. I stepped closer to help, my own awareness sharp, every glance and motion weighted with the subtle tension that had been building between us over weeks of shared moments. The room felt smaller, warmer, more intimate, though nothing had changed physically, only the space between us had shifted, charged with unspoken energy. Then, with a smile that was at once playful and knowing, she said, "Lock the door, let's break some rules." The words were light, teasing, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. My heart raced, and for a moment, I felt the world narrow to just the two of us. I hesitated, unsure how to respond, caught between caution and curiosity. She turned toward me, her eyes holding mine, steady and unapologetic. There was no pressure, only an invitation. I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the edge of a book, the subtle shift of her posture that brought her slightly closer. Every detail felt amplified, the warmth radiating from her, the soft cadence of her voice, the way the amber light caught the strands of her hair. I was aware of every heartbeat, every shallow breath, every subtle movement that seemed to pull me in. We worked together in a delicate dance of closeness and restraint. Hands brushed occasionally while reaching for objects, a shoulder leaned near mine as we shifted positions, subtle touches that lingered just long enough to be noticed. The playful teasing in her tone made me laugh, though my laughter was tinged with nervous anticipation. There was a silent acknowledgement between us now, a recognition of the tension, of the curiosity, and perhaps of the desire simmering beneath the surface. What made the moment so compelling wasn't urgency or intensity, but the intimacy of shared space, the subtle electricity of proximity, and the unspoken communication that passed through every glance, every laugh, every fleeting touch. It was a moment suspended in time, where ordinary actions became charged with meaning. When she finally smiled at me, that familiar, knowing smile, I realized that the connection we'd been cultivating, through conversations, laughter, and quiet touches, had reached a new depth. It wasn't about crossing lines or giving in to impulse. It was about the awareness of what was possible, the thrill of shared curiosity, and the recognition of emotional intimacy in its purest form. As I left that evening, my thoughts lingered on the moment, the teasing invitation, the warmth of her presence, the subtle brush of fingers, and I knew that our connection had evolved. Something powerful had shifted, and I was both exhilarated and cautious, aware that the next steps would define not just the tension between us, but the bond we were quietly building. After the teasing tension of the previous evening, the next visit carried a quiet sense of anticipation. The house felt familiar, but each corner seemed more alive with unspoken understanding between us. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, humming softly as she prepared tea. The aroma of chamomile and honey filled the air, warm and comforting, yet somehow intimate. Our eyes met, and she smiled, not the playful teasing smile from before, but a softer, more reflective one. It carried the weight of her thoughts and the hint of an unspoken acknowledgement. I felt a mix of relief and nervousness. There was no dramatic declaration here, just the gentle pull of connection that had been growing steadily. We moved to the living room, teacups in hand, and settled on the couch, leaving a comfortable silence between us. I noticed how relaxed she seemed in my presence, yet there was still an unmistakable intensity in her gaze. We spoke lightly at first, about books, the changing seasons, and trivial daily matters, but the conversation naturally shifted to more personal topics. She asked me about my own life, my hopes, and my fears, not out of curiosity alone, but with genuine interest and care. As I spoke, I realized how deeply I valued her attention. She listened fully, nodding occasionally, her hand resting close to mine on the couch. The proximity was comforting, yet charged with meaning. I could feel the warmth of her presence, the subtle rhythm of her breathing, and the unspoken empathy that radiated from her. Each glance and small movement carried weight, and I understood that this connection was about emotional intimacy more than anything else. There was a moment of silence after I shared a personal story, the kind that left me vulnerable, and she reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was fleeting, delicate, but it spoke volumes. I looked at her, meeting her eyes, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly acknowledge the depth of our bond. It wasn't reckless or impulsive, it was a deliberate recognition of the trust, care, and unspoken desire that had been building. She smiled softly and said, "I understand, more than you realize." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. There was no pressure, no expectation, only mutual understanding and a shared acknowledgement of the feelings hovering just beneath the surface. In that moment, the tension that had been simmering between us found clarity. As the afternoon waned, we continued talking and laughing, occasionally brushing hands or leaning closer to examine something on the table. Each touch was meaningful, each glance deliberate. The space between us was no longer uncertain, it was filled with awareness, respect, and the quiet thrill of connection. When it was time for me to leave, we stood together by the door. She placed her hand on my shoulder in a lingering, tender gesture, and I felt the full weight of the emotional bond we had cultivated. There was no need for words to define it. What mattered was that we both understood the depth of the connection and the care we had for one another. Walking away, I felt a sense of warmth and satisfaction. The flirtation and tension had matured into mutual respect, trust, and understanding. It wasn't about immediate answers or dramatic declarations, it was about the quiet, meaningful acknowledgement of what we shared and the promise of emotional closeness that could continue to grow in its own time. Weeks had passed since that evening when the tension had reached its peak. Life continued in its familiar rhythm, yet every visit carried the subtle awareness of what had been acknowledged and shared between us. By now, the connection we had nurtured, through lingering glances, quiet touches, and hours of conversation, was undeniable, though it remained tender, measured, and deliberate. This visit was quieter than most. The house hummed softly with the sounds of evening, the faint creak of floorboards, distant traffic, and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees outside. She greeted me with that warm, reflective smile, the one that had become so familiar, and I felt an immediate sense of comfort and anticipation. We moved through the evening with ease, sharing tea, exchanging small laughs, and talking about the small triumphs and frustrations of our lives. Eventually, our conversation turned inward. She shared her reflections on the past, her hopes, and even subtle fears about what this connection meant for both of us. I listened, my attention unwavering, sensing the vulnerability in her voice and the courage it took to speak openly. There was no teasing now, no playful testing of boundaries, just a quiet honesty that resonated deeply. As I spoke about my own thoughts and emotions, I realized how much this bond had shaped me. The way she understood, without judgment, the way she had drawn me into a space of comfort and intimacy, had left a lasting mark. Our hands brushed occasionally, and when they did, it felt like an affirmation of trust and shared understanding rather than mere flirtation. Leaning closer, we exchanged fleeting glances that conveyed unspoken words, appreciation, care, and the acknowledgement of the connection we both cherished. By the evening's close, it was clear that something profound had formed between us. She reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder, a simple yet meaningful gesture that spoke of warmth, protection, and emotional closeness. I responded instinctively, a soft squeeze in return, knowing that words were not necessary to express the bond we had cultivated. The shared laughter, the vulnerability, the small touches, all of it had built an invisible bridge between our worlds, spanning years and experiences without rushing, without demanding, only inviting mutual understanding. As I prepared to leave, there was a pause at the doorway, a quiet moment suspended in time. Her eyes met mine, and in that gaze, there was acknowledgement of curiosity, affection, and the emotional intimacy that had grown steadily over weeks. There was no need to define the future yet. The significance lay in the present, in the respect, trust, and connection we shared. Walking away, I felt a sense of fulfillment and warmth. This wasn't a story of dramatic declarations or immediate resolutions. It was a story of emotional growth, understanding, and connection. Whether we continued this bond as friends, confidants, or something deeper, the impact was lasting. The experiences we shared had altered the way I viewed relationships, intimacy, and trust, leaving me with the quiet certainty that some connections, no matter their form, are transformative. The last impression lingered, not a rush of passion, but the enduring warmth of human connection, the kind that stays with you long after the moment has passed, quietly shaping who you are and how you see the world.